Comics.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
Boneless Comics Podcast. Comics.
Because they have no soul.
There's something inside of me. He wants to hunt and consume blood.
I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White.
And this is yet another We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones. We're back, baby.
Yes. Sorry about the hiatus, everybody. We're happy to be back. As usual, all the social media links are the same. So at Boneless Comics Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, and at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter.
That's right. And so you can also go to our YouTube channel for videos, after shows, bonus content, and Spidey Joe's one-shots at tinyurl.com/Boneless Comics Podcast.
Yeah, and definitely check out the one-shots because it's kind of a neat way for you to deep dive on a character that maybe we haven't had the time to cover an entire story for. So hopefully that's something that you guys out there enjoy checking out on the YouTube channel. But today we are covering 2020's Morbius Old Wounds by Vida Ayala and Marcelo Ferreira, with backup pencils by Paolo Siqueira and Francesco Mobili. And I really hope that I pronounced everyone's name correctly, and I'm sorry if that is not the case. This is also, it's kind of notable I think this is the most recent story that we have ever covered. So we haven't really talked about this before, but 2020 is basically considered yesterday in comic book time, because when you're getting one piece of a story every month, it's really not been that long ago since this wrapped up. So yeah, be a little bit more interesting looking at something that's super relevant, super of this time, as opposed to 10, 20 years ago.
Yep. Well, let's jump right into the writer, Vida Ayala, who worked in book retail, event coordination, building management, baking, and museum security day and graveyard shift. Vida has several other creator-owned books written in various styles, including post-apocalyptic, horror, urban fantasy, and cyberpunk fiction. Works for Marvel include a lot of the New Mutants, which is basically an X-Men spinoff, some Battle Royale type stories, stories about a group that operate in the absence of the Avengers called the Squadron Supreme, and of course this story arc for Morbius. But Vida has written a lot of stories a lot of titles for DC also, including for the Bat Family, for Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Suicide Squad, and many others. So a lot of the major players there. And Vida has done a lot of other franchise comics work for companies like Dynamite, IDW, Image, Valiant, and more. So we're definitely not talking about a brand new writer who's been handed Morbius, but someone with experience in the comic book writing arena.
Yeah, this is one of those names where I think it's come across, my eye a few times when reading things, particularly at DC. I think Green Lanterns would be where I ran into Ayala, but I don't remember a specific, like story arc or anything like that I was like, oh man, I want to get more of this author. So kind of interesting to be covering somebody that I'm a little bit less familiar with. Speaking of people that I'm not super familiar with, we have the penciler, Marcelo Ferreira, who is a Brazilian-born artist that worked both professionally as an artist and instructor of the arts in the late 90s, working with indie publishers early on, such as Ape Entertainment and Dark Horse Comics. And he's had a short but very prolific career with various publishers, and now works under exclusive contract for Marvel, which is something that, both of the big two companies really like to do, is like lock down a creator for a certain number of years so that they can't go work for the competition. So this is pretty typical. But because of that, Ferreira has not done any work for DC that I could find, at least when I was doing research. So his works outside of Marvel include Richie Rich, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Transformers, and Black Dynamite. But most of the modern work, again, has been for Marvel, like I said earlier. So he most recently was penciling on your boy, The Amazing Spider-Man's title, as well as contributions to the Absolute Carnage versus Deadpool miniseries and the Punisher tie-ins to War of the Realms, which is an event book that they did a year and a half, 2 years ago, somewhere in there. Actually, a big problem that I had when I was researching Ferreira was that there is a famous Honduran footballer that has exactly the same name with the same spelling. So I don't know if that region of the world it's just a common name or like what that is, but it was really hard to find any kind of like biographical detail on the artist because most of it was devoted to the sports person. Yeah.
Which is
Sorry,
not the
you
same
just-
person.
yeah, they're just not the same person. So actually at first I thought they were because I was doing research and I was like, oh, interesting. He retired from being a soccer player, as we call it here in the States, to become a penciler, but that's not the case at all. So anyways, it's hard to break down Ferreira's style. I think it was a really good fit for this book because as we're going to get into, Morbius is a little more of a horror based character. It's more of like a monster story. So what Ferreira was doing was somewhere kind of between like naturalistic realism and cartoony, energetic stuff. The other Brazilian artist that I know really, really well is Jorge Jimenez, who's done a ton of work at DC on Superman, Batman, Justice League, a lot of the really high profile titles. And he leans in hard to the like cartoony, energetic, like if it's going to look very energetic but be super cartoony, he's going to lean into that. Whereas I feel like Ferreira pulled it back from that a little bit and kept it a little bit more grounded while still showing a lot of movement. And there is a lot of movement in this book. There's also a lot of like particulate matter, like blood and water and spit and stuff on a lot of the pages, which kind of goes with the horror thing. So I think Ferreira was a pretty good fit for this title. It didn't exactly stand out to me as something that I was like, wow, this is, stellar, but it was a good fit for the story. It was never distracting. I think the only thing that really bugged me about it was that they did have a different penciler for issues 4 and 5. It was a little more noticeable in issue 4 than 5 to me. Issue 5, it was one of those where I looked at it and I was like, is it somebody different? Because I think they kept consistent inking and coloring team throughout to kind of keep it, a little more consistent. But I don't know. What did you think of it, Joe? Did you notice when that change happened, or was that distracting to you at all?
I noticed it, but it wasn't like a lot of other changes where you go from completely opposite styles, like from that hyper realism to something more cartoony or vice versa. So it wasn't abrupt. And like you said, some of it, I guess, was semi-consistent with what came before. So it looked similar, even though it was different versus
Right.
something that just like completely throw you off. So no, it didn't detract or bother me or anything like that. But there was something that stood out to me in one of the earlier issues. I don't remember which one, but there's this point where somebody's being shot, and so there's this like bright sunspot on their chest where they're being shot, and then the character doing the shooting has this big like light profile on them, and it looked like this cool explosion frozen in time, which I thought was drawn like really well and really neat. And it wasn't like a story point or anything. It was just literally somebody being shot at, during a fight. But
Right.
it was still kind of cool to see. So
Yeah,
some
it was pretty kinetic. It was pretty energetic, and I think it was definitely never something that detracted from this story. It was always something that contributed and helped communicate what was going on. So I think Ferreira did a really good job.
yeah, but it wasn't on the end of going the super horror route of
Right.
kind of like the cover almost, where you see his fangs and everything's very sharp and creature looking, and the colors are very
Mhm.
like matte, where it's it gives you chills just looking at the art. It wasn't like that in the story, and we can get into how the story is or isn't like that. But I thought the art definitely set the tone for this is serious, and it's sort of got that like Van Helsing kind of vibe to it, but it's not like pure horror.
Yeah, so Van Helsing is actually something that I super want to bring up later on.
Oh, awesome.
So yeah, keep that in mind. I can't remember exactly what year that movie came out. It was somewhere in the early 2000s, but yeah, the Hugh Jackman and Kate Beckinsale movie is what we're talking about. By the way, I'm sure there have been other movies featuring Van Helsing, but I think there's definitely some influence in this story. So
Well, so for the purposes of this story, a little synopsis. Basically, if you haven't heard of Michael Morbius before, he premiered actually in Spider-Man comics and he is essentially a vampire, but he is not a supernatural vampire like you know from those kinds of stories. He is a scientist turned vampire, so he's a science vampire. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
he's got this incurable blood disease and he's trying to cure it, and through this research ends up turning himself into a living vampire. So we'll get more into his origins and little tidbits and things in the after show, but just for our purposes here, basically this is a scientist who turned himself into a vampire. That's pretty much a good, place to start. But in this story, he's working on a cure for his thirst for blood and becoming more desperate because his cravings are intensifying the longer he goes without feeding. So he's raiding this villain that they call the Melter and acquires new compounds to be able to test a cure. But unfortunately, there's not really any lab rats or really a whole lot of time, and no one else has this disease, so there's no research to go on. So he ends up just, I think this will work. Let me down it and see what happens. And of course, unfortunately, it amplifies his mutation. It enlarges his bones, mutates him into more of like a bat-like abomination. So now things are getting worse instead of better. So he's looking for a way to reverse not only what happened to him before, but also this new change. And now he has to contend with childhood friend turned vampire hunter Elizabeth, who teams up with the Melter. So Spider-Man does make an appearance in this story, and he actually tries to help cure Michael Morbius. But while they're able to sort of restore him back to the original Morbius vampire form before he got all this additional mutation, his DNA is really too changed to revert back to fully human. And their experiments then fall into the hands of the Melter, who then uses them to create his basically like a small monster army. Spider-Man, Morbius, and Liz, they're all forced to sort of ally together in the end to take down the Melter and his unholy abominations and manage to cure all of them and turn them all back into humans, except for Michael Morbius, of course, who's stuck being a vampire still.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the science vampire thing that you mentioned earlier is really interesting because when Morbius is attacking the Melter's lab, the Melter is like aware that vampires exist, and he's like, "Oh, we're being attacked by a vampire." I mean, it's a big deal, but it's not a big deal in that he's like, "Oh, vampires exist." It's kind of like everybody knows that they're out there, but what sets Morbius apart is that he did it to himself through an experiment. He wasn't bitten, he wasn't turned. So that doesn't mean that regular vampires don't exist somewhere else out in the Marvel universe, because that's obviously, Blade's whole deal. But that's not what this story is concerned with. This is very much a blood disorder, basically, that makes him appear and act like a vampire, but he's not a vampire in the supernatural sense. And I think they mention at one point that he doesn't have a lot of their weaknesses either. So that was kind of interesting. I wished that Vida Ayala had expanded on that a little bit more, but maybe that's something that was established in like previous stories. But what do you think of turning this vampire character into an anti-hero that sort of aims the blood draining at criminals? Because I at least for my part, I think that's a pretty novel idea as far as like we're gonna have a vampire, but sort of turn it into a superhero book. Is that something that you kind of knew going in?
So having been familiar with Morbius prior to this because of, he came from Spider-Man, and that's kind of my thing is reading Spider-Man. So I've been familiar with the history and the character for quite a while, but I hadn't actually ever read this as a solo title. So it's kind of neat to see Morbius strike out on his own in his own story, but then of course Spider-Man was there anyway, so it's still tied to that. But the things that I like about Morbius are, like we mentioned, he's a science vampire. So he's not a supernatural vampire. And that in and of itself just takes you to various different places in storytelling where you don't even need to visit the supernatural. So it's a way to have that type of character, to have a vampire, but not have it be, oh, there's also werewolves and fairies and, other stuff too. It's like just, there's one vampire as far as we're concerned, and that's Morbius. And there are others out there somewhere, but we don't really deal with those in the story. It's not like he ever tries to, go join a nest and join with other vampires. He's really like that self-tortured soul of he did this to himself and he can't control himself and has to feed on living people for their blood, but he doesn't want to. He's reluctant. So he's sort of that I don't know if anti-hero is the right word because he's that hero type character, but he's plagued with something that makes him seem as if he would be a villain character. But his motivation is to try not to hurt anybody. Whereas
Yeah, I guess that's true.
he's not like somebody who's like, well, I like hurting people, but I'm going to try not to do it because I'm trying to be more hero like. He really just he doesn't want to hurt anyone. He's, just a scientist. It's not like he was out there being a mercenary or, anything like that before.
Sure.
So this is something that he's like, I don't want to do it, but I can't stop myself.
Hmm.
So that it just really makes for some interesting storytelling. And Morbius has always been that self-reflective character, almost like an actor on stage. Like he has a lot of these very verbose narrations that he'll sort of tell, and like the way he talks, he almost sounds like we open the book with a quote from Aristotle about human nature, and we're talking about Morbius having the struggle between human and something else that's not entirely good, and wrestling with that, and what is man, and all these thought-provoking statements. So Morbius is kind of like tiptoeing on that edge of we're sort of acknowledging that there are vampires in kind of our mainstream Marvel continuity that's popular, but we're just going to focus on this one, and he's not even a traditional vampire anyway.
Yeah, it definitely makes it more of like a sci-fi horror aspect than like a fantasy horror or something like that, where you just have to accept that things are going on, which really with Marvel and the way that their universe is set up makes a lot of sense. Because again, I've mentioned this before, but I really think Doctor Strange is kind of their main magic guy. And for the most part, everybody got their powers from like radiation or, genetics or something that seems to be explainable within like the scientific realm. So Morbius falls right into the Marvel universe, kind of with that type of an origin story.
Right.
Yeah.
But he's not in that separate section of all the Marvel vampire books. Like they don't really
Right.
cross over.
Yeah, like Tomb of Dracula, and those books were popular in the 70s. I don't know if any of them are still running, but I think that's a hard sell today to do something new with like the Dracula character that hasn't been done. So I think it was smart of them to create Morbius to kind of have that crossover character that can kind of exist in both worlds, but he still very much feels like, yeah, he's a part of the Marvel universe, and he's still got that sweet open jacket that shows his chest muscles and everything, that sort of comes up like a cowl around his neck, but not quite. It's funny that he's still wearing that sort of like 1970s collar and everything. I could see him like putting a gold chain on with his jacket open or whatever.
Little too cliche there, but since he's the only one, it's okay.
Right.
Well,
Exactly.
and maybe that's just him being like, well, I guess I'm a vampire now, so I should dress like one. What does a vampire dress like? I don't know. Here. I'll put on this outfit.
He went to the vampire clothing store.
Ah, there you
They
go.
were like, all we've got left is this jacket. It's like part of a Dracula cape. It's not the whole thing. You'll have to tuck it into your pants. But
So I guess he would be in the anti-hero category.
well, I mean, that's why I asked you that question, because I'm honestly having trouble kind of sussing that out for myself, because he doesn't kill in this story, which was very surprising to me, because I was just assuming going in that he's a vampire. He's going to be, he'll be going after criminals, but he'll be draining them of blood and killing them and stuff like that. But the writing goes out of its way to say like, no, those people will be okay. It's kind of like the old cartoon trope, right? Of like, I saw their parachutes, they're fine. Like he bites somebody and he's like, they'll need skin grafts, but they'll be okay. That kind
Yeah,
of thing.
there was a lot of that like kind of commentary and weird dialogue that I was just like, are we doing this? Because they show this scene and like I saw this part and I was like, oh, he does kill some people. Like those people are totally dead. And then yeah, it was one of those comments where they're like, well, I drained enough blood from them that they'll be weak for a couple days, but they won't remember this encounter. And I'm just like, wow, that's not only a extreme level of control just over his like physical ability to do that, but also the primal urge of needing to drink blood. He was able to stop that. But it was also like they totally made it look like he killed these people, and then
They really did.
oh, they're okay. Don't worry about it. They're actually fine. Like as
Yeah,
an afterthought.
There's a little bit of a disconnect between the art and the writing there, maybe, because yeah, the art definitely makes it look like that's a lot of blood. Like that person is not okay. And then he's just like, well, they'll be fine in a couple days. It's like, all right, Michael, I'm sure they'll be just fine.
I think as a storytelling device, it would have been better to announce that up front, like have Morbius have some sort of internal dialogue, and he's like, as much as it pains me to, I'm going to feast on just enough of their blood so that way they'll be weak and not pose a threat, to my plans, but also not enough to actually cause any permanent damage. Say it up front like that as he's doing it, and then it's like, oh, this is a deliberate thing that he's doing, and it makes sense versus as an afterthought where he just goes on a rampage, you see blood everywhere, and then some character has a line of dialogue, oh, they're fine, don't worry.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I almost wonder, did Morbius appear first in like the 70s?
Yeah, 70s, early 70s.
Okay. So the comics code would have still been a big deal at that time. So I almost wonder if they introduced this character in order to basically have a vampire character without the censorship tamping down on them.
So
But then they were like, we're not going to have him kill, but like now it's become a character trait kind of thing.
yeah, there's a whole thing about, that's why he was created as a character. And, we can give more details on that on the after show. But basically, his creation was at that time period. So you're right. This could be something that originally it was them sort of taking a soft landing of, well, we're going to have a vampire, but he's not a true vampire and he doesn't kill. So it's a little easier for folks to digest in the early 70s. And then, now, like you said, it's a character trait. It's just something that he kind of does because I think it makes sense within his personality, right? Like I said, he's a scientist and he's not, a mercenary who's used to killing people. He's never killed anyone in his life. And now he, has that ability and even has the motivation because he needs blood to survive. So it's like, what do? You don't really have a choice.
Right.
But it's not that he wants to do it or he starts to enjoy it or he's like, blood does taste good. Hey, you know what? People are just cattle. I think I'm going to, pave the streets in blood because, yeah, evil, it's not like that where he starts to go in an extreme.
I think the only point in the story when we see him really lose control is once he like injects himself with that experimental formula that he's trying to cure himself with, and it starts mutating him and like his bones are altering their shape or getting bigger, and he gets bat wings and all that stuff, which by the way was really cool.
That was
really
neat,
well
yeah.
done with the art. But I think that was the point where you start to see him kind of like he's attacking people, but like while he's doing it, he's saying stuff like, you need to get out of here, like I can't control myself right now, and it's going to be really bad for you if you don't leave. I mean that. So yeah, he definitely keeps that kind of sympathetic air throughout, even when he's mutating into this horrible monster where he's like, I really don't want to be killing people, and that's why you guys have to leave.
Right. It's sort of that Jekyll and Hyde thing of like, I have this alter ego and I can't control it and I don't approve of what it does, but I can't do anything about it either.
Yeah. Is it right after he kind of like shoots up and starts mutating that Spider-Man pops in to check on him?
Yeah, he's at the part actually, I think, where he takes out a bunch of guards and it looks like they're dead, but then he's like, oh, I just weakened them. I think one of them is not weakened all the way and manages to trigger an alarm. And so Morbius gets upset, goes to investigate. And so he's kind of like yelling at this guy, threatening him like, all you had to do was be quiet and just let me do what I need to do and we would have been out of here. But now you're making noise and all this other stuff and it's starting to get to me. And
yeah.
And then that's when Spider-Man shows up and he's like, hey, I thought you were doing the hero or anti-hero thing. Like, why are you suddenly like going after these people? And so I do like that Spider-Man, like when he shows up, he's kind of giving Morbius more of a chance to explain. Because a lot of other times, and I think in Lethal Protector, it was like that with Venom, where Spidey shows up and he's like, you're just back to your old tricks again. Okay, time to take you down. And, that's not what Eddie Brock was doing. It just, things weren't working out very well for him and they aren't working out very well for Morbius in this either. So it's one of those where he shows up sort of at the wrong time where it looks like Morbius is just feeding on people again, but he actually gives him a chance to explain and like, well, what are you doing? I thought you were in Brownsville and protecting those city. They actually considered you a hero. Like what's going on? And just asking questions rather than punching first, which I thought was really
right. I'm going to go on record and say that I enjoyed Spider-Man in this story infinitely more than in Lethal Protector. And holding up that as an example definitely makes me realize how much better it was implemented here, because one thing that I thought was really cool is that we really get to see him doing science with Michael Morbius, where he's like, okay, let's, break down this compound, let's try and find a cure for you, let's try and find a way to reverse this. And you get to see Peter using his mind to fight instead of his fists, which is a really important character trait for Spider-Man that we never seem to see enough of in like the media adaptations of him. So I was really glad that that was highlighted here, and that honestly Spider-Man is there more as like moral support and to help Michael Morbius with the science than he is to like fight any supervillains or anything like that. Now he does figure into the climax at the end because you've got to have some action in the story, but I thought there were just really good character moments between them and that they played off of each other well. And Spider-Man had his quips in there and everything, and he was doing that, but he didn't overpower Morbius's story. Whereas I feel like in
Right.
Lethal Protector, Spider-Man kind of took over Venom's story about halfway through.
Yeah, I thought this was a good example of Spidey showing up, and like the writing for him was really good and that it felt true to the character. But like you said, he didn't overpower and take over the story. He's kind of just showing up to further Morbius's story, and he factors into it in a great deal. Like
Mm-hmm.
he actually discovers that Spider-Man's blood is the key to regressing his condition to some extent. So there's this link between Morbius and Spider-Man that Morbius needs Spider-Man's blood, but obviously, Peter doesn't want to give it up because, well, it's his blood and it's important to him, but also because, of everything that he's been through in his backstory with the radioactive spider and tracing down, where that came from and what was involved in it, and then protecting all of the people around him. He wouldn't want anybody at a basic level to take his blood and discover his secret identity,
Yeah.
or to find some way to unlock something in his blood that could be used to create some sort of super army, or something to that effect. So he's safeguarding this secret, and so for Morbius, who he doesn't really trust that much, to need his blood, it's really a big deal. But it was really neat how Spidey, like I said, came in. He made a quip about, I wrote this down, Bela Lugosi, which he
Oh
called
yeah.
him, which is a reference to the first actor to play Count Dracula in 1931. Like, wow, it's 2020. That's a real deep cut there, Spidey.
Yeah, speaking of monsters, this was something that I noticed in your notes, and I had meant to mention it earlier, but kind of forgot about it. But speaking of deep cuts, they actually show a flashback to that time that Spider-Man turned into that spider creature with like 6 arms, and I don't know the story behind that or whatever, but that was cool as like a little continuity callback to be like, oh yeah, Spider-Man's been a monster at some point too, and so it showed a little bit of a character beat there of like maybe this is why he's a little more sympathetic to
Yeah,
what's going on with Morbius.
that was and it's funny because it was a similar situation where at the time Spider-Man was like, I'm tired of being Spider-Man. It's ruining my life. I want to be Peter Parker. So I'm going to develop a serum to take away my powers, and I'm just going to chug it down and hope for the best. And so, like, that's what happens literally the issue before Morbius appears. So then Morbius is like, oh, it's going to take more than, a freak with 6 arms to take me down. Because at that point, like, when they first meet, that's the form that Peter is in, is that, like, spider monster with the 6 arms and the, like, spider face.
Right.
But yeah, so there's a lot of that just with Spider-Man in general. So I think it was a really good fit to link Morbius to this, where he's sort of that same storytelling concept for Spider-Man, where it's like the genetic mutation and the radioactive blood, and my condition, I don't want it to worsen, because if Spider-Man was mainly a spider, then he probably wouldn't be that friendly of a neighborhood Spider-Man. So
Sure.
that's kind of where Morbius is. It's like his dark half is, it's not just a spider, it's a freaking vampire. So it
Right.
wants what it wants, and he kind of wrestles with that other side of him.
Right. Yeah. Some other characters that I'd like to talk about a little bit are Elizabeth and Emil, which Emil doesn't really get a whole lot of time on the page, but it's basically explained that he was childhood friends with Michael, and I don't know, like they went to grade school together. Elizabeth was his sister, and she was kind of in love with Michael Morbius. And then it's implied that Morbius actually killed Emil post-transformation. Is that what actually happens? That was what I understood from this story, at least. So,
Yeah.
but there's basically two levels of break between Elizabeth and Michael Morbius's relationship. There's that, which obviously is gonna, ruin any friendship. But also, she apparently at some point in college confronted him with like, "Hey, I love you," and all this stuff, and he was like, "Well, you're like a little sister to me." The kind of
Right.
like the you're gonna be in the friend zone thing. And I guess they remained friends after that, but it was kind of a rocky relationship because she wanted more and he didn't, and all of that. So all of that factors into when she shows up in the story. One thing that I honestly thought was a little bit funny though was her outfit, because she basically, this is where I said I was going to bring up Van Helsing again.
Yep.
She basically looks like they crossed Hugh Jackman's outfit with Kate Beckinsale's outfit from that movie, and they just like mashed them up, because like she's got the cap and the crossbow and like the jacket that Van Helsing has in that movie, but then she has like the bustier and the high like stiletto boots and everything that like Kate Beckinsale was wearing. So it seemed to me like they basically just took those two characters and like mashed them into one, and they're like, Elizabeth the Vampire Hunter, this is what she looks like. So it wasn't one of those where it like took me out of the story or anything. I just thought it was kind of funny when I saw like what her character design was. I'm like, is that really what she goes vampire hunting in?
It's funny
Okay.
because like,
Um,
yeah, I saw that, and one of the things that I first thought was actually from Blade Trinity, Whistler's daughter, played by
oh yes,
Jessica Biel.
Jessica Biel, yeah.
That's what it made me
Uh-huh.
think of. I was just like, whoa, I feel like I was just taken back in time here. The outfit is retro.
Yeah, it's very like of that early 2000s time period. For
One
sure.
thing I never understood about vampire hunter outfits is like, wouldn't you want to have Kevlar weaved into the neck piece and like have
Yes.
gauntlets over your wrists so that way you protect, because those would be your most vital areas that a vampire would go to suck your blood. Whereas she has like a cape and she has that bustier, but I don't think there's anything protecting her shoulder area, and the cape is like just barely covering her neck. So like if she's
Yeah.
afraid that at one point Morbius would try to, suck her blood, wouldn't you think you'd want to invest some money into like armoring that area?
At
But
least put on like a choker or something. I don't know. Like
some bird spikes around your neck.
Yeah, like something. You'd want something there to make it a little more difficult, at least, to get to
Yeah.
the veins. I don't know, but it's just one of those where like it's a very it's an outfit that was basically made for visual reasons, and it's not actually practical. Which,
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of those action movies from that time period are that way too. But it was kind of a funny callback to that era. And Van Helsing was what I thought the whole time, especially with that little mini crossbow that she's carrying around with her all the time. I'm just like, oh yeah, that's like that was his whole deal. So
Yeah. The whole character backstory with Elizabeth and Emil, like I thought that it was, well, without giving anything too much away, I thought it was more compelling of a story than what they did in the Morbius movie that just came out.
okay,
But essentially what happens here is that Morbius, yeah, he transforms, he kills his best friend, overcome with grief, he goes like on sort of a mini rampage, and so, people know what happened to him, and Elizabeth spends her life, with those feelings of regret and unrequited love and everything,
right.
fueled also with avenging her brother from what Morbius turned into. So it's like this whole thing just created this perfect stew of, anger that we actually see her fighting some kind of weird creature. I didn't know if it was like another vampire type creature or what that was, but she basically went like full Van Helsing and took down some beasts to sort of like practice for the day that she'd encounter Morbius.
Yeah, I'm not sure what vampires look like in the Marvel universe, and that's probably one of those things that varies from artist to artist. But I just kind of assumed that was some sort of vampire monster she was fighting as training. I kind of wanted to see more about her training period too, because there was like a whole group that she was with that seemed to be like training her to fight vampires. So
Yeah.
that was pretty interesting. I don't know if that's something explored in like other comics or in like the Blade mythology somewhere. That seems like the most logical place for it to be. But yeah, that was cool. I mean, I thought that her story overall was pretty good. I did think she has kind of a turn at the end where she sees that Morbius is, actually still a person and that he's fighting it, and she becomes a little more sympathetic and switches sides. And I do get her switching sides to fight the Melter, because what he did was just like basically go into a room and he's like, yes, I'm trying to make monsters, which is obviously very different from what Michael Morbius did. She came around to his side of thinking a little bit too quickly for me. I would have been happier if it was more of like, I'm going to team up with you to take these things out, but then like, we're done. I'm never going to talk to you again. Cause she's so adamant in the early portion of the story that like, no, I'll never trust you again. No, I'll never believe you. Totally like consumed by revenge, that it seemed like it was a little bit quick for her to have that turnaround.
This is one for me where the turnaround, like maybe the time in which it happened was quick, and this being 5 issues, that partly being why.
Right.
But she's carrying this guilt and this anger and this like old love for him that she overcompensates by training herself to be able to take him down one day. And I think, and the Melter calls it, right? Because he's like, I bet you when the time comes or whatever, you're not going to be able to pull the trigger. And that's sort of what happens is she has like a little
that's
hesitation at the end, because, Michael's like, you know what, you're right. Go ahead. Like, I'm trying to find a cure for this, but I can't. And really the best cure is just go ahead and kill me. And she hesitates long enough to let her guard down enough to see that, Morbius is actually in agony over what happened, and he's not doing it on purpose. And he's not turned into something evil. It's still Michael in there. And that's just enough time for it to completely backfire and the mutation to take over. And then he actually does turn full beast, and her worst nightmare is realized. And he's like, you should have killed me when you had the chance. It's like typical monster creature feature.
Yeah.
So it made sense that, as much as she tried to, because like they were talking about this being, it's not justice, it's revenge. Well, actually it's kind of both. So fine, whatever. Like she's been preparing herself her whole life to get back at him, but she still cares about him enough that, if he's still there, then maybe she was wrong, to take the path that she did. And I thought this made her a really more of a 3-dimensional character in like a short amount of time, for her to sort of have that revelation. And then it just, the story kind of sweeps us away from there, that we don't really get to spend a whole lot of time in it. But I thought it was a pretty well written.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's all fair. As far as I know, she's a new character as well. I'm not familiar with her, but you're obviously a lot more familiar with the history. So I think more likely you would have seen her before if she had showed up before this story. So yeah, one thing, I do get the feeling that this series was canceled prematurely. And so I almost wonder if it was intended to be paced out to 6 issues, because there's actually a preview of the cover of issue 6 at the end of issue 5 saying like next issue, and here's like the cover, but the series got canceled. So I'm almost wondering if this was intended to go a little bit longer, but then Vida Ayala had to wrap it up early because, maybe the sales weren't there or something like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But another character I do want to mention that actually is from previous runs and from Spider-Man is the Melter. There's actually like 3 main versions of him. And he gets his name because he actually has powers that he can shoot a beam and melt things. So they call him the Melter, which makes sense.
This is pretty on the nose. All right.
So this is again a character that was created in like 1963. So, on the nose was definitely what they were doing back then. But during the Superior Spider-Man run in 2013, there's a gang war with what's called the Goblin Nation, which, it being a Spider-Man comic, you can guess who the Goblin is. But there was a time where old supervillain equipment was actually being sold on the black market to low-level criminals, and then these criminals would become the latest like version of that villain. So they would take on the equipment and the name and essentially become that villain, but they were just, some henchman who was able to procure that equipment. So that's where we get this version of the Melter, is he's just some guy who was able to get his hands on the Melter costume and put it on, and now he's taken on that persona.
Oh, so he's like a knockoff.
Yeah, basically. And that's why he has no powers. Like, that's why he uses a gun. His name is the Melter, but he can't do any melting anymore. He's the ex-Melter.
When your name is the Melter, but you can't do any melting. I
not,
feel like
not
that's
a good combination.
There's a meme out there that could be made out of that somehow.
But what we do find out about this version of the Melter is that he's apparently, decent in chemistry. So I've never taken a chemistry class, but he says that he got good grades in chemistry in school. And I don't know if that's high school or college level or, what it was. But when I read that, I was thinking, is that really enough to justify him recreating a serum and adding a little kick to a serum that he says was a prototype that was developed by a highly respected and Nobel Prize winning biologist specializing in the field of human and animal biology with a medical degree in hematology? Because that's what Dr. Michael Morbius is. And he spent his entire life with this serum, and this knockoff Melter guy who's got good grades in chemistry in school is able to turn people into weird creatures that they have to end up curing. And I'm just like, that's a little too much for me to swallow here.
That's funny because I felt like that wasn't necessarily the aspect of him that bothered me that much. I just felt like his look was so like superhero comic book and kind of like older superhero comic book that he as a character didn't feel like he tonally fit as well within this story. Because I'm like, who is this lame supervillain that's just like showing up in our, basically our sci-fi monster story that we have going on. And I realized that they needed somebody for them to team up and fight at the end, but I don't know if the Melter was necessarily the right choice for that role. I don't know. There had to be some other mad scientist out there with like better credentials and a less goofy look. Because he has like those medieval chainmail helmets that people would wear like back in the day, but it's colored like bright orange, and he's got like this orange jumpsuit on and everything. And I don't know, it was just very strange tonally to have this guy that's like, he went to the supervillain store and dressed up in his crazy outfit, and he's in the middle of this, like, I don't want to say grounded story, but it's trying to take like a serious like sci-fi look at the vampire thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know. He just felt like he didn't fit in the story.
They could have had literally the same guy with some other generic name and either no outfit and just make him look like, a dude in a villain, whatever. I guess he wanted a bloody costume, so they put him in one.
I want a bloody costume.
It seemed overly complicated to have this guy who is a knockoff of an existing villain and didn't have his powers and had this weird motivation and didn't fit within the story. And it's just like so many things all at once. Like if he had just been some guy that they made up for the story, maybe it would have fit a little bit better.
Right.
Or maybe he had personal stake because, Morbius had weakened, someone that he cared about. And, I guess he didn't, Morbius doesn't kill, so he can't say, you killed my, brother or whatever. But
except for Emil, I guess.
Well, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But, just have some kind of motivation that like loosely ties him to the story. Like, oh yeah, I hate the vamp too because of this one instance that happens that takes one panel to explain. Now let's move on. Just something.
Yeah. Instead, it was more like you raided my lab. That annoyed me and set me back as a criminal. And, oh, you have this serum. Cool. Maybe I can make monsters. It was like there wasn't a lot of thought put into his motivation or, anything like that. He was kind of there really to facilitate the big fight at the end of it more than anything else.
Yeah.
So something that I don't know if it bothered me. It was just sort of a question in the back of my mind throughout this story, was that we do have as a story beat in this Michael Morbius basically repeating the same mistake that created him in the first place, where he's got a serum, it's untested, and he's like, I'll just shoot up with it or I'll just down it and see what happens. And so when it blows up in his face, is that a surprise? I mean, it's one of those, what they're going for is sort of like that horror, like there's no cure, you're never going to be able to be cured of this, you're going to have to make peace with this condition. And I do get that, but at the same time I do feel like it makes him look like not a very good scientist when it's like he's doing the same thing again and expecting a different result. Well, this time when I down a crazy formula that I haven't tested, it's going to fix me, you know.
Yeah, we mentioned that a little bit before, and I was trying to come up with like reasons of, well, he doesn't have a proper lab for testing. He can't get, rats to test it on, and there's nobody else that has this condition, so it's not like he could use another doctor's research notes or some like stock solution to sort of try out the formula and test it. And I think there are a lot of science reasons why it would be very difficult and he would have to resort to more like human trials. But at the same point, like just downing the whole thing and hoping for the best seems like a little too far.
Seems like a bad idea.
Yeah. Like there's got to be some kind of trial. Hey, I injected myself with like, 0.001 milliliters just to see what happens. And I noticed that I started to get hungrier. So it's a good thing I didn't inject myself with a full vial because I probably would have turned into, a giant bat with cool looking wings.
Sure.
And then this whole story goes away.
Yeah, I mean, and that's obviously the problem. I mean, I don't know how you could achieve the same result without having that moment of him kind of doing the untested thing. And there's so much cool art of him mutating and kind of doing like the Dragon Ball Z transformation where it's like form change now, and he becomes the giant bat or whatever. We would lose all that stuff if we didn't have that moment. I thought it weakened the character a little bit as a scientist to be like, well, he's doing this again.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I think it's one of those like, if you were to classify everything, this would fit the Ratchet and Clank world concept of, specifically with Ratchet, that he's trying to find his people. And the prevailing theory is if he does ever find his people, it's probably over. Because once he finds them, then he doesn't need to go on these adventures. His whole motivation for going out into the galaxy is pretty much taken care of because that's what he's trying to do. And once that's solved, then there's no more story. So you kind of have to dangle it out there like a carrot to say, oh, you almost got there, or, oh, you got it, but you had to give it up, but you'll get back again. And it's the whole like, will they, won't they struggle that you have to keep open because otherwise your story is over. And I think we have that here where, if Morbius ever does cure himself of this vampirism, the story's pretty much over. He just turns into, maybe a benevolent scientist who's donating to funds for research, and he goes on to win more prizes and cure people of diseases. And that like it's a good story, but it's not like the superhero supervillain struggle story that we're trying to get out of these comics. So
very
it's
true.
difficult.
It's kind of like if the Punisher ever went to Frank Castle goes to anger management and like gets healthy and then he stops going out and shooting people all the time, and it's like, well, I'm happy for you, but now we have no more story,
Right.
So I get what you're saying.
It's like you have to keep that fundamental motivation. If it's his parents that got killed, well, he's got to, even if he's 50, that's got to be enough to fuel him to want to go out into the streets and dress up like a bat and, punch people in the face. And if he ever reconciles that and is able to put that to rest, then you lose the motivation for the character. And so the question becomes, how long can you keep a story like that going until you have to find kind of new motivation? But we seem to be sort of retelling the same thing, just in different. So like in this, he's looking for a cure, but instead of, curing himself or getting sick or whatever, it actually goes the opposite direction and makes him into more of a vampire. And so we deal with that. And then, there's another story where now he's looking to make a cure, and what it does is it severely weakens him to where he's not able to even be human. And, we have to work on that. And it's like the same thing happens. It's just the direction that it goes in and what you have to do to recover. And it starts to become like kind of formulaic. And I think that's what's hard about these kinds of titles is how do you, as a writer, pull out of that, cycle and tell something completely new without redesigning or retconning the character's history.
Yeah, I think the element, honestly, that is new about this story is Elizabeth. And giving them some kind of reconciliation actually gives Michael Morbius something new to go through
Hmm.
or to experience than maybe we've seen in previous stories. And again, I'm not super familiar with his history, but I would think that something like this is fairly unique to this one. So I guess in that sense, her turn has to happen at the end because that's really what makes this story unique and stand out from just another, oh, he's looking for a cure and he couldn't find it type
Yeah,
deals.
I don't know if it's the backstory maybe being limited too much to where it just kind of limits where you can go with the character, or if it's just the character itself. Like if you take Spider-Man, I mean, his motivation's pretty simple, right? His Uncle Ben was killed, and so
Yeah.
now with great power comes great responsibility. And something about that just seems to be like fresh with him is that, every struggle that he goes through is like a reminder of great power comes with great responsibility.
Yeah.
And it just sort of continues from there. And it's not like you don't feel like you're revisiting, oh, yes, we know about Uncle Ben. Okay, enough with that.
Yeah,
It
they
doesn't
don't
get
go back to the Uncle Ben well too often.
right
I don't think.
to like bring
Yeah.
it up all the time to where he's just
Mhm.
like, he can't move forward because he's stuck in the past,
Right.
which seems to happen to a lot of characters. And maybe that's where it is like if the character is stuck in the past, then it's really hard to have that, to take them in different directions because you have to focus on that element of their past.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Something that I thought of as you were talking about that was Mr. Freeze at DC. Actually, I think he's the character that in that way is the most similar in that he has a fantastic setup, he has a fantastic backstory, but really once you've told that first origin story with him about how he's trying to basically find a cure for his wife and he's stuck in this suit and he's a monster now and how does he cure her basically, and he'll do anything to do that, and then he fails and goes back to prison. There's really nothing to do with him except have him keep repeating that cycle.
Right.
And so it's one of those where like he's a great character, but it's almost like they told a complete story with him like right off the bat, and you don't really need to see him again after that because there's not really anywhere else to take him. I mean, they've tried to do weird stuff like they brought Nora back and now she has the whatever cold problem he has and she's more of a merciless killer than he is and all that kind of stuff, and it's just like, all right, you guys are grasping at straws here. But it feels like Morbius stays within his world pretty well, and like they've not done anything to break the character, so that to me is a very good thing. I don't know.
Oh, for sure. And obviously, we're still creating new stories and more interest for this character because, here we all are all these years later and we have a standalone movie with this character now and we have, all this comic history and I don't, know for sure if there will be a sequel or not, but I'm sure we'll see the character turn up, if the mid-credits scene means anything at all, we'll see him turn up again at some point somehow.
I mean, if Jared Leto gets easier to work with in Hollywood, maybe we'll see.
Yeah.
That
Well, that
from
would be
my understanding, that's a lot of why the movie was delayed, but was because of like difficulties with just kind of dealing with him as a person. So
yeah.
I don't
Well,
know.
that might be one of those easily rectified situations in that like okay, so for example, in the movie, he turns back into Jared Leto Hollywood bod and we see his six pack and all this stuff and then the vampire sort of comes out here and there to do its thing. Whereas in the comics, once Morbius turns into a vampire, he's ugly forever.
Yeah, that's true.
If they decided to go with the movie route and like give him CG and change his voice a little bit and hire a different actor, they could conceivably say, well, his mutation's permanent now, and so that's why he looks like this, and he's voiced by James Earl Jones or some famous voice actor, and bring in that way. And I'm not saying they should replace him. I'm just saying like this might be an instance where it would be easier to replace than somebody else.
It would be pretty easy to kind of write him out.
But I hope they don't. Hope
Yeah,
there's more.
no. So I guess the final point that I really wanted to touch on, I know that horror isn't necessarily one of your like big genres that you're a fan of. I think I've traditionally been more into that, where I'm kind of leaning away from it a little bit more now, where my interest in it has definitely dropped off from what it was, 10, 15 years ago. But did this story manage to connect with you given that it's in that genre.
I wouldn't consider this the horror genre. I think it's like either
Okay.
entry level horror or it's like has those elements, but I wouldn't like classify it in those sections. But I did want to sort of elaborate on
Interesting.
the horror feel, like, and part of the reason why I don't think it's that way in here is because we're not really like put into these scenarios that create. I think there's like principles of horror
Oh,
genre that are
sure.
like, fear and dread and despair or whatever. But I don't think we really get those in this story. This is more about like a character arc and something that he's sort of wrestling with, like the demon within. It's not
Sure.
an actual like vampire that's going and taking people out, and it creates, because usually like in a horror either book or movie or whatever, you feel that sense of dread or tension. It's kind of like, and
Oh, that's true.
this is the part why I don't like the horror genre, is like the same reason why you don't really like the action movies where you're a part of the action, where you literally have the camera strapped to the car during an action scene and you're
Right.
bouncing all around trying to figure out where are the cars at, where are these explosions. Like, you like the action scenes, you just don't want to feel like you're stuck in the middle of them. Well, that's how I am
Okay.
with horror is, the stories are cool, but I don't want to feel like I'm stuck in the middle of it. Like,
That
those
makes
those
sense.
movies that you watch and the movie's over and you're like, whoa, and then you look around and you look at the darkness and you're like, that thing that I just saw in the movie is going to come out of the shadows any second. That's what I think horror is, and maybe I'm wrong, but
No, I think that's a good observation because I was just kind of at the baseline level making like a cursory analysis going like, oh, it's a vampire story. But you're right. It doesn't do that like victim perspective thing.
and nobody dies.
And yeah, which is really surprising given how much blood there is in this.
Hmm.
It's really surprising that nobody dies. Do any of the guys turned into monsters at the end? They don't even die, do they? They all get
No, they turn him
like
back into
stabbed
human
with a
form.
syringe and then
Hmm.
wake up like I was just a rat monster 2 minutes ago. Wow, that was crazy,
Whoa,
guys.
I had the weirdest dream.
So yeah, that's a good observation. So it's really more of a sci-fi story with horror elements is probably a better way to describe it.
Yeah,
So
I think so. Like, if you're into the typical vampire cult following, I don't know this would be something that you'd be interested in because, like we mentioned before, there's not any other vampires in it. It's not really a vampire story. It's more a story
right,
about the Morbius character and the fact that he's wrestling with vampirism, but
right,
it's
right.
not your like typical vampire story because he's based on a science experiment.
Sure. Well, there was science. He just failed. Um,
Miserably.
I'm probably ready to go to final thoughts unless there was anything
Yeah.
else you wanted to discuss.
I think this one's a pretty straightforward one for me because, again, this isn't a 5-star like this is the definition of comics, that sort of thing. I feel like I need to reserve that for, my top 5 favorites. But
Right.
this definitely wasn't on the bottom level. Like, it was interesting. I thought the story that they told was actually kind of better than what they did in the movie, so I definitely rate it higher than that.
Oh, that's good.
But and the art was good. There wasn't anything in it that like stood out except for the whole Melter thing, which we mentioned earlier about
Right.
his good grades in chemistry. That was the only thing that I was just like that was really out of place for me. And the character himself, I guess I didn't think much of him to begin with, so it didn't bother me that he was in that outfit. But looking at it sort of further back, it's like, well, why does this guy have this costume? And where does he get his name, and what's he even doing here? It's kind of weird.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't think it destroyed the story, and I thought it was a cool,
No.
a direction to go, to have this sort of like old friend, or could have been a potential romance but wasn't. The Van Helsing elements, like maybe that was a little too cliche, and there's a lot of like goofy lines in here, but it's got the Morbius nature of quoting Aristotle and wrestling between his human side and something that's not good. So I thought it was
Mhm.
well put together overall. So I would say my final rating would be a 4 out of 5 on this one.
So it is very much designed to be kind of one of those comic book disposable pleasures where you're just getting like an exciting story. It's got a little bit of a character arc and it tells a complete tale. There's not technically nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't really stand out to me as being like some high example of the genre either. But at the same time, I guess if you're shooting for making sort of a monster superhero comic, this is probably about the best you can do. So I'm a sucker for high concept stuff anyway, that takes like a sci-fi concept and, does something weird with it. I mean, a lot of our favorite Star Trek episodes will take a sci-fi idea and then, sort of run it through the mill and see what we can do with it. So I guess I think I'm going to go with like a weak 4 for this. Maybe even a 3.75. I think it was really good. I think it just didn't quite get to a 4 for me. And I'm having a hard time pinpointing why. The Melter was definitely the element that took me out of the story the most, but it's definitely playing with a lot of interesting ideas and interesting concepts. I think maybe if it could have been paced out a little bit longer, maybe like one more issue, that would have improved it. And again, I'm not really sure why it was that it got shortened to 5, especially when they already had cover art done for a 6th. But yeah, I think I'm happy with a 3.75. We don't usually do like fractions of numbers like that, but I think that's where I would put it. So it's a very, very strong 3 for me.
Well, I don't know how you would take a banana and cut it into 3.75 out of 5 segments, but that's what we've done on this comic book. So
that's right.
And our average is even harder to calculate. So there you go.
Man, yeah, it will be. I'm just making it harder on myself at the end of the season.
All right. Well, that will have to be it for Morbius for today, but don't forget to tune into our after show after this to hear more about Morbius and interesting factoids from the Amazing Spider-Man era, as well as some thoughts on the movie as well.
Oh, very
Then
cool.
next time, we are going to talk about Doctor Strange Across the Universe, which collects number 1 through 5 from 2018, written by Mark Waid and penciled by Javier Pina and Jesus Saez. And I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
Oh, I know Saez, and I know Mark Waid is like one of the best writers in the industry. So
Should
yeah,
be
this
good.
is I'm biased, but that's probably going to get a good score from me. So thanks everybody so much for listening this time, and we'll look forward to getting some more content out there for you.
All right. Thanks so much.
We like
Comics?
because they have